Hi, this is CG Jam with another tutorial mini-series. In this series we're looking at that fundamental of texturing and materials, and that is UV unwrapping. So what is all this unwrapping thing? I see a lot of people on the websites asking questions and wondering why they're having problems, and this series aims to cover some of those problems and give you a good idea of how to get you all set up ready for painting or simply just transferring image textures onto your models. To do that we need to unwrap our object. So what is unwrapping? Well, basically unwrapping is the art of taking a 3D object and spreading it out into a 2D world onto an image so that you have the best dispersion of the image on the faces of your object. So rather than getting technical, we can look at it as, if you think about it using the box as an example, you can think of it as a cardboard box and we have to print it. So we need to unfold the box, lay it out on the printer and let the printer put the design on, and then you fold it all back together so that it's all folded. And this principle works whether you're using a box or if you have a complex mesh such as an animal, and you just need to unfold it in much the same way that you would turn it into an animal print rug. And the same is exactly true for your 3D character models. You unwrap them and lay them flat in exactly the same way. So rather than starting off complex, let's take a look at the UV unwrapping process with this simple plane. First thing we need to do is open up our 3D window a little bit and change the other window to a UV image editor. As you can see, we have this 2D grid which represents the space of the where the image will be, and this grid will map to the faces of our objects. So there are two ways that we would use UV unwrapping. One is with simple images such as photographs and normal maps, bump maps and such like, and the generated images which we would generally use as a canvas for texturing or texture painting, using the texture paint tools here in a 3D workflow. Alright, so first let's take a look at this, and we'll start off by opening up an image by pressing the new button in our UV image editor. Leave all that the same, but I want this generated type, I want that to be a colour grid, and if we click OK we see that we now have a grid of squares, all conveniently labelled and coloured, and we need to map this plane onto these colours. So let's close down this panel for the moment, reduce that panel as well, just tuck it away in the side, we will need it later. And you'll notice I'm using Blender internal render engine because it's easy. The process of unwrapping and mapping to the images is exactly the same in Cycles as it is in Blender internal, so I don't really need to mess around and show you anything there. Let's get on and start unwrapping. You'll notice there are no actual tools in object mode for unwrapping because everything UV related is done in edit mode. So if we switch to edit mode, you now see in the little tabs at the side a shading and UVs tab, and we can ignore the shading options and we just concentrate on the UV mapping and unwrapping options. You can see we have a drop down menu and it gives us different options to unwrap our plane. So we can ignore most of these, in fact all of these, and we can simply unwrap our cube, and you see there all the vertex points have been mapped to the corners of the image, but you'll notice we can't actually see anything on our cube. Now this is where things get slightly different between Cycles and Blender internal. In Blender internal you can preview the image on your mesh without actually applying it as a texture. And we do that simply by going to shading, switch the shading type from multi-texture to GLSL, and tick the textured solid box. Now in Cycles there's no GLSL mode for shading, and you would have to apply the texture to an actual material setup, and that's as simple as just adding a texture node and choosing the image texture. I'm sure most of you who use Blender are familiar with how to set up cycles textures, so I won't go into that this time. But you can see that now that we've got everything set up, if I press 7 on my number pad, I go into top perspective view, and we're looking straight down on top of our image, and that's exactly the way that the 2D image works. If you look at the widget here, you'll see we have an X and Y axis, X and Y going up and down from top to bottom as it appears, and the X axis being from left to right. And in the UV image editor, if you were to move any aspects, you would constrain them to the Y-axis to move them up or down, and the X-axis to move them left or right. There is no Z-axis on the 2D editor because it's 2D space, remember. Okay, so taking a look at our plane, we can see it's basically laid out as is. But what if we needed an image texture that was not a full square? Maybe it was HD image, which is 1920 by 1080 pixels, and obviously that would be an oblong. Well, let's open an image. We'll go to our downloads file, and you can just pull any image off your hard drive or off Google for this, as we're just playing. And if I choose this brick wall close-up view, you can see the image has been replaced on our preview, and we can see the wall as it is. But if we scroll out, because our image is a lot bigger than the image that we had previously, so we need to scroll out a little bit, you can see there's the size of the image is longer than the size of the plane, so therefore all the image data has been squashed together to make it fit into this window. As you can see, there's these dark bricks on the side here, and there they are on the side of the plane, and this little brick here, and you can see all these oblong bricks have been squashed down into square blocks. And well, that's not too bad on this plane. It's not what we're looking for, because generally when we have a texture, we're looking for an accurate representation of the image on our mesh. So where's the problem? Well, the problem comes through the way that we've applied the mesh. If I just press U to unwrap again, you see this little menu here, which is our properties, and if you don't have this, it's probably tucked down under this little plus icon. Or you can press F6 like so, and bring up a floating menu which you can drag around the screen to a more suitable position. Sometimes, there we go. And it has the same options as the little panel in the sidebar. So let's have a look at these options. It's angle based, and there is a conformal method which isn't as good as angle based. It's kind of, you're better off leaving everything on its default there. Fill holes will fill holes in your mesh for some reason. You don't always want your holes filled, but we'll ignore that for now as we have no holes. But down here we have this correct aspect, which is what's causing the problem, because that correct aspect is telling the UV editor to use the aspect ratio of the image and apply it to the UVs, and we don't want that. So if we tick correct aspect and uncheck the box, you'll see now our UVs have snapped back to the square that we wanted them in the first place, which is perfect. And you'll see we're only covering a portion of the image, but the image, the size and shape of the blocks on our preview are the right size. Now, another thing about UV image editor, it has the same options for moving and rotating as the 3D view. So if I press G, I can move my image around. If I press R, I can rotate it, and you can see that happening in the 3D view. And if I press S, I can scale in my image and focus on even just a single piece. Let's have this block nice and centered. Of course, yeah. And now I have this brick as my main image on my UVs, which is pretty cool. Control Z. There, back to how we should be. So the next thing we need to know about UVs is that this image isn't all there is. If you see this grey border around the image, this border actually tiles this image. So the bottom of this image will start repeating from the top of the image, and the left side of the image will be repeating from the right hand side and vice versa. So if I was to press G and move up into a corner, you can see in the preview window that we have our image is repeating, where we end at the top here, from here, down here. This corner is this piece here, and you can see on the opposite side we are starting again from here. So this section of our UVs is taking the information from this corner of the mesh, and you can see that by, if you look at this dark brick here, you can see that they're repeated in the middle of the image, which would be about here on the image editor, for we could see the whole thing tiled. And this is not ideal. You would want to do some cleanup work on your image before you use this as a large map. Let's move that back. And to make images tileable, you have to do some hocus pocus in an image editor such as Photoshop, but it's not as hard as it sounds, and you can get some really nice results. But why would you do that? Because sometimes you want to make your image a lot bigger than it actually is. So we would have a large wall on our image map rather than just a small section, and that's just one way we would use a tiled image. Control Z, go back to normal. Okay, so we've had a look at that. Let's go and have a look at our cube now. Let's go into object mode and go to layer 2 and say hello to our default cube. And now this is where it's all going to get a little bit fun. Oops, let's change back to our UV grid and go into edit mode. Oops, I have to select it. Go into edit mode, and now we have all sorts of three-dimensional problems, because if I just take the cube as it is, tell it to unwrap, it just layers each face, stacks them on top of each other like a big UV sandwich, and we get the identical image on each face. And it's very rare that we would want that, especially if we were going to be painting. Let me just show you here what will happen. I'm sure you can guess already. We have let's put our strength up. If we take our paintbrush and we want to paint some decoration on our cube, as soon as we start painting on the top face, you see our paint job is transferred everywhere, and it's highly unlikely that you would ever want all the faces identical, so we need to unwrap it properly. Let's just Control Z, undo that, undo, go away, and go back to edit mode. So in order to unwrap, if you remember at the start of the video we showed you that box model amongst other things, and we need to interpret our cube in a similar manner. If we take the top face here and we imagine it as being a lid, we need to first think, where would it unfold? And if we say it unfolds along this front edge, then we need to think about how to cut the lid of the box so it folds up and nicely. And because we don't want to destroy our mesh by chopping it up and cutting it and separating faces, we mark seams. So let's do that now. Let's take, holding shift to select the top, take the top of our cube and click mark seam, and you'll see the edge of the cube has been given a red edge, which indicates that there's a seam on that edge. Now again, we need to think about how to unfold this. So if we take this edge and this edge as the sides, so they would unfold in flaps this way. So if I click there, shift click that one, and mark seam, we now have two edges. This is going to unfold straight up and then unfold out, and these edges are going to flap out, only they're not, because we need to put a seam either here or here to tell Blender where to cut our cube. So let's put them along this back edge, mark seam, and now if we unwrap, press U, unwrap, oops, no, we have to select everything needs to be selected. Unwrap. And now you can see that where we've placed those folds on D1 and C1, D1 and C1, D2 and C2, we now have that fold has laid out the box all the way around to D8, so that's all one fold, and these edges that we put on A5 and F5, they have unfolded to the side, which is ideal. It's absolutely perfect for what we want, and we can use this to paint on. We can paint different designs on each face, or we can do edges and just do wonderful things. And we're not using the whole of the mesh obviously, but if we needed to use a bigger portion, say we wanted a 3 squares wide, if we press S and shift just to keep everything constrained, and I move that up like so, and then oops, let's try that again, S, shift about there, and then G, and remember constrain it on the X, and then we can put it over those 3 images, and there we go. Now we can see the face has gone from having 2 to having 3 of the little squares represented, which is great. You can see a little bit of overlapping on D1 and D2 because the scale has done it that way, because it can't fit everything onto the screen at once, and so it's overlapping. We have D8 there. I think that's actually this face here. If we go to the opposite face somewhere, D1, yes, we can see D8 and C8 are mapping onto that side. Okay, that's all nonsense, waffling on for no reason. So that's a simple unwrap, and one of the other aspects of things is stretching that we need to focus on. And what is stretching? Stretching is basically, well, not basically, it is having more information on one face than we have on the others when they should all be the right size. And we can have a look at that by going to face select mode in the UVs. Let's take this middle face and we'll scale that down independently. And we'll say that we did something weird and we got an unwrap like that. And if we look at our cube, we can see that we have got a nice, slightly out of focus, low resolution image on one face, and we've got some weird distortions going on the rest of the faces because the shape of our UVs doesn't correspond with the shape of our mesh. And that happens occasionally when you unwrap, and the easiest way to solve that is to correct your seams. If we were to get that here, our best bet would be to find the face, put in perhaps another seam along the top there, check that, mark seam all the way around, press A, U, unwrap, and it basically takes that face and lays it out on its own little section. Lays it out kind of separately, as you can see down here. We have a separate island doing its own thing, not connected to any of the other faces, just there being its own face. That's fine. A lot of the time you will desire that in a complex mesh. Let's also go back to our plane and go back to our brick textures. Another thing about stretching is sometimes you will be busy with your model, you will have it all finished, and then you'll start animating it and you'll realise maybe it doesn't stretch and distort quite the way you want as you animate it, and you decide to put in an extra loop cut just to give it a bit more movement, but you've already textured it, so this is a problem. If we press Ctrl R, I can show you what I mean. We'll add a loop cut. Now if I just drop the loop cut in the middle, you'll see that nothing changed within the UVs, and if I select everything, you'll see the UVs have actually added that loop right in the middle and everything is fine. But now if I was to put in my loop, but if I wanted it in a different part of the mesh, you'll see it still puts the loop in the center of the mesh where we had it previously, but you'll see that the UVs, this side is taking all this UV data, all this image data, and it's compressing it into this tiny little square, so we've got a lot more pixel data in this square than we have in the one next to it, which what we want is an even distribution of pixel data. So can't fix that now, but Control Z, let's try again. Control R, let's add in our loop cut, and we'll drag it across. You'll see we have the same problem. But before we do anything else, before we start spinning this and looking at it and going ooh and ah and checking out our UVs and wondering, if we come and look at our loop cut and slide properties, there's a little checkbox that says correct UVs. If we tick that, keeping an eye on our UV box, we tick that, and I'll select everything now, we can see that our UVs have been mapped upside down, for one thing. Oh no, our image is upside down, that's why. Press 7 on the number pad, there we go. Slightly awkward, but there we are. As we can see, by ticking that little checkbox, the UV editor has corrected the position of the seam, and our UVs are once again correct, which is what we want. Okay. So I think that's everything for this little section. In our next section we're going to go on to slightly more complex shapes and look at the problems that are provided therein, such as cylinders and UV spheres, and we'll have a look at having a go at texturing some different UV maps onto some of the spheres to see what we get. But yeah, so I think we've covered everything. Have we covered everything? According to my list, we've covered everything for this lesson, so okay. So I'll wrap it up, and I'll just say don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, or bookmark the page on the website, and we will see you next time.